The sound of laughter drifted from the living room as Mira fumbled with her keys, exhaustion weighing down her shoulders after another 14-hour shift at the design studio. She had been looking forward to collapsing into Minj's arms, maybe sharing takeout while he told her about his day at the law firm. The promotion he had been chasing was finally within reach, and she wanted to celebrate with him. But the laughter stopped her cold. It was Jada's laugh, that musical trill that had always made their parents smile, while Mira's own attempts at humor fell flat. Her sister wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Jada had her own apartment across town, her own life filled with Instagram-worthy moments and designer everything. Mira pushed open the front door and stepped into a scene that felt like watching her worst fears play out in slow motion. Minj sat on the couch with Jada curled against his side, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his chest. Their parents flanked them like proud guardians, her mother holding champagne flutes while her father beamed with approval. The conversation died as Mira appeared, for pairs of eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from guilt to defiance. Minj shifted slightly, but he didn't pull away from Jada's touch. He didn't even look ashamed. Her mother spoke first, voice bright with forced cheer. She announced that there was wonderful news to share. Jada and Minj had been spending time together, getting to know each other better, and they had discovered they had so much in common. The words hit Mira like physical blows. She remembered those study sessions Jada had mentioned over the past few months, how she had started asking questions about Minj's cases, his goals, his favorite restaurants. She remembered her sister's sudden interest in joining the gym where Minj worked out, her convenient appearances at the coffee shop near his office. It had all been deliberate. Every casual encounter, every shared laugh, every moment of connection had been calculated and planned. Jada looked up at Mira with eyes that sparkled with triumph masked as innocence. She said how sorry she was that things had worked out this way, but sometimes the heart wanted what it wanted. Love couldn't be forced or planned, she explained, and she and Minj had simply found something special together. Mira found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. She asked how long this had been going on, how long they had been lying to her, while she worked extra hours to help pay for the apartment she thought she and Minj would share. Her father cleared his throat and stepped forward with the authoritative tone he used when delivering verdicts. He explained that Mira needed to understand that Minj was an ambitious young man with a bright future ahead of him. Jada understood his goals in ways that Mira simply couldn't. They moved in the same circles, shared the same vision for success. The implication was clear. Mira, with her freelance design work and her secondhand clothes, had never been good enough for someone like Minj. She had been a placeholder until something better came along. I know this might feel overwhelming. And if you're watching this from somewhere where you feel alone or unsupported, I want you to know that you're not the only one who has felt completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love them. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes just knowing others understand can help us feel less isolated in moments like this. Minj finally spoke, his voice careful and measured like he was addressing a jury. He said that Mira had to know their relationship hadn't been working for months. They wanted different things, had different priorities. Jada understood his need to build something meaningful, to create a legacy that mattered. Mira stared at him, remembering all the times she had listened to his dreams, supported his late-night study sessions, celebrated his small victories. She had rearranged her entire life around his schedule, turned down projects that conflicted with his important events, even learned to cook his favorite Korean dishes from scratch. But none of that mattered now. Jada had played a different game entirely, one where she positioned herself as the perfect accessory to his ambitions rather than a partner who would challenge him to grow. Jada's hand moved to her stomach in a gesture so subtle that Mira almost missed it. Almost. The movement was protective, possessive, and it told Mira everything she needed to know about how thoroughly she had been replaced. When Jada whispered that there was something else they needed to share, something that made their situation more complicated, Mira felt the last of her hope crumble away. The pregnancy announcement came wrapped in apologies and explanations about timing and unexpected feelings, but Mira heard only the sound of doors slamming shut on every possibility of reconciliation. Her mother rushed to embrace Jada, cooing about grandbabies and wedding plans while her father shook Minj's hand with pride. They were already a family, already united in purpose and joy. Mira stood in the doorway of what had been her home, watching her entire life be rewritten to exclude her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told them she understood perfectly. They had made their choice, and it wasn't her. Jada's eyes filled with crocodile tears as she pleaded for understanding, for forgiveness, for Mira to be happy for them. She insisted that she had never meant for things to happen this way, that love had simply found them despite their best efforts to resist. But Mira was done listening to lies. She turned and walked back toward the door, each step feeling like she was walking through quicksand. Behind her, she heard her mother calling her name, heard Minj's voice trying to explain that they could all still be friends, that this didn't have to change everything between them. Everything had already changed. They had seen to that months ago when they decided her feelings were acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of what they wanted. They had made her invisible in her own life, erased her from her own story while she was too trusting to see the knife approaching her back. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, and Mira realized she had nowhere to go. The apartment she had helped furnish belonged to Minj. The family home was now Jada's domain. Even her parents had chosen sides, and she had lost before she even knew there was a war being fought. She walked down the empty street with no destination in mind, her phone buzzing with messages she didn't want to read. Each notification felt like another twist of the knife, more explanations and justifications that would only make her feel smaller and more disposable. For the first time in her life, Mira was completely alone, and perhaps that was exactly where she needed to be to finally see clearly. 3 weeks after the night that shattered her world, Mira had transformed her pain into productivity. Her small studio apartment had become a fortress of creativity, every surface covered with sketches, color palettes, and half-finished designs that represented her desperate attempt to rebuild something meaningful from the ruins of her life. She worked through the nights when sleep refused to come, when the silence grew too heavy with memories of laughter that had never been meant for her. The freelance projects came steadily now, word of mouth spreading through Seoul's creative community about the designer who delivered exceptional work with inhuman speed and unwavering professionalism. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning when exhaustion had finally forced her to rest, her laptop balanced precariously on her chest as she dozed on the couch. The sender's name meant nothing to her initially, Cho Tae-yong Foundation, but the subject line made her sit up straight despite the ache in her neck from sleeping in an awkward position. The message was formal yet warm, explaining that they had seen her recent work for the Contemporary Arts Museum and were interested in commissioning her for a significant project. A charity gala to raise funds for a new children's hospital wing needed complete visual identity design, from invitations to stage backdrops to digital presentations. The timeline was aggressive, the scope was massive, and the compensation mentioned made Mira's eyes widen. This was the kind of project that could establish her reputation permanently, the kind that other designers would fight to include in their portfolios. She spent 2 days researching the foundation, learning about their focus on medical care for underprivileged children and their impressive track record of successful fundraising events. The founder, Cho Tae-yong, remained somewhat mysterious despite his public philanthropic work. There were photos from charity events showing a tall, distinguished man in perfectly tailored suits, but few interviews or personal profiles. Something about his eyes in those photographs drew her attention. They held a weight that spoke of experience beyond what most businessmen carried, a depth that suggested he understood genuine loss rather than simply managing abstract charity causes. The foundation's offices occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in Gangnam, all glass and steel reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue after so many gray days spent hiding in her apartment. Mira arrived 15 minutes early, portfolio case gripping tightly in her hand, wearing her best blazer over dark jeans because she no longer owned anything that Jada would consider appropriate for such an important meeting. The elevator ride felt endless, each floor number lighting up like a countdown to either opportunity or humiliation. She had grown used to disappointment lately, to having her hopes raised and then crushed by people who found her wanting in ways they were happy to enumerate. The reception area was understated elegance, all warm wood and soft lighting that made her feel calmer despite her nerves. The receptionist, A woman with kind eyes and professional grace informed her that Mr. Cho was running slightly behind schedule but would see her shortly. When the inner office door opened 20 minutes later, Mira looked up from her nervous review of portfolio pages to see a man who commanded attention without demanding it. Cho De-young was taller than his photograph suggested, with silver threading through dark hair that was styled with casual precision. His suit was clearly bespoke, but he wore it like comfortable armor rather than a costume designed to intimidate. He approached with measured steps and extended his hand, introducing himself with a voice that carried the slight roughness of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his volume. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, lasting just long enough to convey respect without crossing into inappropriate territory. She responded with her name and thanks for the opportunity to meet, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. His office was larger than her entire apartment, but furnished with restraint that suggested confidence rather than ostentation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seoul, while carefully chosen art pieces created warmth without distraction. He gestured toward a seating area away from his imposing desk, choosing the chair across from her rather than positioning himself behind a barrier of authority. When he asked to see her portfolio, his attention was complete and focused in a way that made her feel like the only person in the world who mattered in that moment. Mira opened her case with hands that had stopped trembling, spreading her best work across the low table between them. He studied each piece with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed he understood design principles beyond what most clients bothered to learn. He wanted to know about her color theory choices, her typography decisions, the way she balanced emotional impact with practical functionality. No one had ever asked her those questions before. Previous clients had focused on timelines and budgets, treating her expertise as a service to be purchased rather than knowledge to be respected. De-young listened to her explanations with the intensity of someone who truly wanted to understand her creative process. When he asked about her design philosophy, she found herself speaking with passion that had been dormant for months. She explained how visual communication could bridge cultural and economic barriers, how thoughtful design could make people feel seen and valued regardless of their background. Art had the power to heal, she told him, to create connection where none had existed before. His eyes never left her face while she spoke, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or appreciation for someone who understood that meaningful work required more than technical skill. It demanded empathy and vision and the courage to believe that beauty could matter in a world that often seemed determined to crush anything tender or hopeful. The project details he outlined were ambitious in scope and timeline. The gala would host 500 of Seoul's most influential philanthropists and business leaders, raising funds for a children's hospital wing that would provide free care for families who couldn't afford treatment elsewhere. The visual identity needed to convey both elegance and compassion, sophistication and accessibility. He spoke about the cause with quiet intensity that suggested personal investment beyond professional obligation. When she asked what had inspired his commitment to children's medical care, his pause was brief but revealing. He mentioned that some lessons came at costs too high to measure, and that creating something positive from loss was sometimes the only way forward. The budget he mentioned was generous enough to support her for months, but more important was the creative freedom he offered. He wanted her vision, he explained, not a reproduction of previous events or safe choices designed to offend no one. Trust was implicit in the commission, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight with anxiety since the night her family chose sides against her. As their meeting drew to a close, he walked her to the elevator with the same measured grace he had shown throughout their conversation. His security detail was subtle but present, men who carried themselves with military precision while maintaining respectful distance from their employer. She noticed how they positioned themselves to protect without crowding, how their eyes constantly scanned for threats that seemed unlikely in this pristine corporate environment. There was something about the way they deferred to him that suggested his authority extended beyond philanthropy and business ventures. The careful politeness, the watchful alertness, the sense that crossing him would have consequences far beyond angry emails or contract disputes. But none of that dangerous undercurrent touched the way he treated her, as if she existed in a separate category that deserved only respectful professionalism. When the elevator doors closed between them, Mira caught her reflection in the polished steel and saw something she hadn't seen in weeks. Purpose, direction, the recognition that her skills had value and that someone with obvious power had chosen to trust her with something that mattered to him. She walked out of the building with her spine straighter than it had been since the night she discovered Jada's betrayal. Portfolio case no longer feeling like dead weight, but like a tool that could build something worth creating. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again instead of a discarded version of someone else's expectations. The commission represented more than income or career advancement. It was validation from someone who clearly understood excellence and had chosen to see potential in her work. Whatever shadows existed in Chodiyong's world, he had offered her a chance to create something beautiful in collaboration with someone who appreciated what she could contribute. As she navigated Seoul's crowded streets toward home, Mira began sketching concepts in her mind, ideas flowing with an energy that felt like coming back to life after a long illness. She had forgotten what it felt like to be valued for her talents rather than judged for her inadequacies, and the feeling was intoxicating in its simplicity and power. The design sessions became a rhythm that anchored Mira's weeks in something stable and purposeful. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she arrived at the Cho Foundation with fresh concepts and refined iterations, her portfolio case now familiar weight in her hands as she navigated the gleaming lobby toward elevators that no longer intimidated her. De Jong had cleared his schedule completely for their meetings, something his assistant mentioned with barely concealed surprise when confirming appointments. Apparently few clients or business associates received such dedicated attention from a man whose time was measured in investments that could reshape entire industries. His private conference room became their creative sanctuary, walls covered with mood boards and color samples that transformed the sterile corporate space into something alive with possibility. He had ordered a drafting table specifically for her use, along with professional lighting and every tool she mentioned needing, as if her comfort and productivity were investments worth making without question. During their third meeting, she noticed how he studied each design with the same intensity she had seen when he discussed the hospital wing project. His questions revealed an aesthetic sensibility that surprised her, an understanding of how visual elements could manipulate emotion and memory in ways that transcended mere decoration. When she asked about his background in design, he smiled with something that looked like melancholy mixed with pride. He explained that his late wife had been an artist, someone who taught him to see beauty as a form of resistance against a world that often tried to crush anything delicate or hopeful. She had believed that creating something meaningful was the most defiant act possible when surrounded by destruction and despair. The revelation hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Mira found herself sharing details about her own relationship with art, how design had become her refuge during childhood years when she felt invisible in her own family. Creating something beautiful had always been her way of proving she existed, that her perspective had value even when everyone around her suggested otherwise. Their conversations began extending beyond scheduled meeting times, flowing seamlessly from professional discussions into explorations of philosophy and experience that felt natural rather than forced. He ordered dinner during particularly productive sessions, always asking about her preferences before calling his assistant with specific requests from restaurants that delivered cuisine she had never imagined experiencing. The meals arrived on real china with proper silverware, served by staff who treated the conference room like a private dining establishment. She learned that he preferred simple foods despite having access to luxury, that he read voraciously across multiple languages, and that he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of classical music that rivaled professional critics. During one late evening session, she discovered a leather-bound volume of Korean poetry hidden beneath quarterly reports on his desk. When she asked about it, his expression softened in ways she was beginning to recognize as rare glimpses beneath carefully maintained professional armor. He explained that his son had given him the book years ago, back when they still shared interests that extended beyond business obligations and family expectations. The poems were about finding beauty in unexpected places, about learning to see hope when surrounded by violence and betrayal. Poetry had become his anchor during periods when his work required him to make choices that weighed heavily on his conscience. The admission revealed layers of complexity she had sensed but never understood. His business interests clearly extended beyond philanthropy and legitimate investments, into territories where moral compromises were necessary survival tools rather than character flaws. Yet he spoke about these shadows with regret rather than pride, as if power had been thrust upon him rather than eagerly pursued. She found herself sharing her own struggles with family dynamics, the exhaustion of always being compared to someone who seemed designed to eclipse her achievements. She told him about growing up invisible, about learning to find worth in creating beautiful things because no one seemed interested in recognizing her value as a person. His attention during these revelations was complete and unwavering, making her feel heard in ways that previous relationships had never managed. He listened without offering solutions or judgments, simply witnessing her experiences with the respect they deserved. Physical awareness crept into their interactions gradually, subtle shifts that transformed professional courtesy into something charged with unspoken possibilities. His hand lingered when passing design samples, fingertips brushing hers with contact that felt deliberate despite its brevity. She became hyper-aware of his proximity when he leaned over her shoulder to examine details, his cologne mixing with the scent of expensive fabric and something uniquely him. During particularly intense creative moments, she caught him watching her with expressions that went beyond professional appreciation. His gaze tracked the movement of her hands as she sketched modifications, the way her lips pursed in concentration, the unconscious grace with which she arranged elements into compositions that pleased them both. The late-night session that changed everything began like all the others, with design revisions spread across the conference table while Soul's lights glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows. She was adjusting invitation typography when he mentioned the personal motivation behind the hospital wing project. His voice carried weight she had not heard before as he explained that his wife had died from complications that could have been prevented with better medical care. She had been pregnant when the illness struck, and they had lost both mother and unborn child because the nearest capable hospital was hours away, and treatment had been delayed by bureaucratic obstacles that money alone couldn't overcome. The foundation was his way of ensuring that other families would never face impossible choices between financial ruin and watching loved ones suffer. Every gala, every fundraising campaign, every dollar raised represented his attempt to transform personal devastation into something that could protect others from experiencing similar loss. She set down her pencil and turned to face him fully, understanding flooding through her as pieces of his character suddenly made perfect sense. His careful distance from dangerous business associates, his dedication to causes that served vulnerable populations, his obvious comfort with violence balanced by genuine gentleness toward those who deserve protection. Without thinking, she reached across the space between their chairs and covered his hand with hers. The contact was electric, sending awareness through her entire nervous system while simultaneously feeling like the most natural gesture imaginable. His fingers turned beneath hers until their palms pressed together, connection that transcended professional boundaries and acknowledged something deeper growing between them. When he asked why she had never married, why someone with her talents and heart remained unattached, she found herself explaining about relationships that had treated her as convenient rather than cherished. Men who appreciated her skills when useful, but never saw her as someone worth choosing when more appealing options presented themselves. He studied her face with intensity that made her breath catch, as if memorizing details that mattered more than any business consideration could. When he spoke, his voice carried conviction that left no room for doubt about his sincerity. He told her that any man who failed to recognize her worth was either blind or stupid, possibly both. She possessed qualities that couldn't be bought or manufactured, authenticity and strength that made her infinitely more valuable than people who offered only surface attractions and calculated charm. The compliment hit deeper than anything she had heard in years, delivered with the certainty of someone who understood genuine value and refused to accept substitutes. In his world of carefully managed appearances and strategic relationships, authenticity was probably the rarest commodity imaginable. Their hands remained connected across the table while they discussed final gala preparations, neither wanting to break contact that felt too significant to treat casually. When he mentioned that the event still needed a guest of honor, someone who embodied the foundation's values and could speak authentically about the cause, his invitation emerged naturally from their conversation. He wanted her to attend not as hired help or background support, but as his personal guest and collaborative partner. The suggestion felt like recognition of everything she had contributed, validation that her vision had helped create something worthy of celebration. Standing to gather her materials at evening's end, she felt his presence behind her as he moved to help organize design samples. The proximity was intoxicating, his warmth radiating through the space between them, while his cologne created an intimate atmosphere that made her pulse quicken with awareness. When he handed her the final portfolio case, their fingers brushed in contact that lasted seconds longer than necessary. The touch sent electricity up her arm, while his eyes held hers with intensity that acknowledged everything unspoken between them. Walking toward the elevator, she felt transformed by more than professional success or creative accomplishment. For the first time in her adult life, she felt genuinely seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered enough to change how she viewed herself and her possibilities. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel had been transformed into Mira's vision made manifest, every detail reflecting months of careful planning and creative collaboration. Soft lighting bathed walls adorned with her custom-designed backdrops, while centerpieces incorporated the foundation's colors in arrangements that suggested both elegance and hope. The visual identity she had created flowed seamlessly throughout the space, from invitation designs displayed at the registration desk to digital presentations cycling across strategically placed screens. Mira stood near the entrance in a midnight blue dress that de Jong's stylist had insisted was perfect for someone who needed to look like she belonged among Seoul's elite. The fabric moved like liquid silk across her skin, and for the first time in months she felt beautiful rather than invisible, valued rather than disposable. De Jong appeared at her side with the quiet authority that seemed to part crowds without effort, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy that made her feel treasured rather than escorted. His tailored tuxedo emphasized the broad shoulders and confident bearing that commanded respect from everyone they encountered, but his attention remained focused entirely on her comfort and enjoyment. As they moved through the gathering crowd, she watched her designs come alive in the hands of people who had the power to fund dreams into reality. Conversations buzzed with enthusiasm about the hospital wing project, donors writing checks with amounts that could transform entire communities. Her visual storytelling had helped create an atmosphere where generosity felt natural rather than obligatory. De Jong introduced her to pharmaceutical executives, technology innovators, and cultural leaders with pride that made her chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. He presented her as the creative visionary behind the evening's success, someone whose talents had elevated their mission beyond simple fundraising into meaningful art that touched hearts as well as wallets. The Seoul elite received her with courtesy that felt genuine rather than polite, asking thoughtful questions about her design process and creative inspiration. Several mentioned they would be contacting her for future projects, recognition that could establish her reputation permanently among clients who appreciated excellence and were willing to pay appropriately for it. During a brief lull in introductions, De Jong leaned close enough for his breath to warm her ear as he whispered how proud he was to have her by his side. The compliment sent heat through her entire body, awareness that had been building for weeks finally acknowledged in the intimate gesture and possessive undertone that suggested she belonged to him in ways that transcended professional collaboration. She was laughing at something amusing he had said about a particularly pompous donor when movement near the ballroom entrance caught her attention. Two figures approached through the crowd, and recognition hit her like ice water flooding her veins. Minj looked exactly as polished and ambitious as ever, his tuxedo probably costing more than her monthly rent, while his perfectly styled hair gleamed under the ballroom's lighting. But it was Jada who commanded attention, her pregnancy now obvious beneath a designer gown that probably cost more than Mira's entire wardrobe, her radiant smile suggesting she was exactly where she belonged among Seoul's most influential families. The shock of seeing them paralyzed Mira completely, her hand tightening involuntarily on De Jong's arm, as every carefully rebuilt confidence crumbled in an instant. They were walking directly toward her position, Minj's eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her with surprise that quickly transformed into something approaching horror. De-Young noticed her sudden tension immediately, following her gaze toward the approaching couple with protective awareness that suggested he was prepared to handle whatever threat had captured her attention. When Minj reached speaking distance, his greeting toward De-Young carried formal respect mixed with obvious confusion about finding his father accompanied by someone who should not exist in this rarefied social sphere. The moment when understanding dawned was excruciating in its clarity. Minj addressed De-Young as father with the careful politeness of someone maintaining appearances, while his eyes remained fixed on Mira with disbelief that she could possibly belong in this environment. De-Young's expression shifted from protective alertness to dawning comprehension as he processed the obvious familiarity between his son and the woman he had been courting. Jada stepped forward with predatory grace, her smile sharp enough to cut glass as she assessed Mira's transformation from defeated sister into someone who clearly belonged among their elevated social circle. Her greeting carried false sweetness that barely concealed territorial aggression. Congratulations on Mira's obvious success, delivered with undertones that suggested this elevation was temporary and undeserved. When she asked how Mira had managed to secure such an important project, the implication was clear that connections rather than talent must explain her presence among legitimate professionals. Jada's tone suggested she was offering rope for Mira to hang herself with, expecting explanations that would reveal fraud or deception. De-Young's intervention was subtle but unmistakable, his hand moving to Mira's lower back in a gesture that claimed her, while his voice carried edge that warned against further provocation. He explained that Mira was the brilliant designer responsible for the evening's visual success, someone whose talents had exceeded his highest expectations and whose partnership had been invaluable in creating something truly meaningful. The protective declaration sent shock waves through the small group, Minj's face paling as he realized his father was not simply working with his ex-girlfriend, but actively defending her against his pregnant girlfriend's veiled attacks. Jada's smile faltered as she processed that her attempt at humiliation had backfired spectacularly. Minj attempted damage control with stammering explanations about previous relationships and unfortunate coincidences, but his discomfort was obvious to anyone watching. His father's disapproving stare suggested that whatever explanations were coming would need to be significantly more convincing than anything he had managed so far. The tension was interrupted by camera flashes as society photographers captured what they assumed was a charming family moment. De-Young with his son and their respective partners at Seoul's most exclusive charitable event. The images would appear in tomorrow's newspapers and social media feeds, creating speculation about relationships that none of them were prepared to explain publicly. Jada seized the photography opportunity to position herself prominently beside De-Young, her hand moving protectively over her pregnant belly while she smiled with practiced perfection for cameras that would immortalize her connection to one of Seoul's most powerful families. Her performance was flawless, suggesting she belonged in this sphere while implying that others might be temporary visitors. Mira felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of watching her past collide with her present in front of hundreds of witnesses who would dissect every gesture and expression for entertainment value. The confidence she had built over weeks of meaningful work crumbled under the weight of Jada's obvious comfort with public attention and Minj's barely concealed panic about explaining their complicated history. De-Young seemed to sense her distress, his protective instincts overriding social conventions as he excused them from the group with authority that brooked no argument. He guided her toward a quiet alcove away from curious eyes and potential photographers, his focus entirely on her well-being rather than the social implications of abandoning his son during an awkward moment. In the relative privacy of the secluded area, surrounded by her own designed decorations that had seemed so triumphant minutes earlier, Mira found herself explaining the devastating history that connected her to the young couple currently posing for photographers. Her voice remained steady despite the tremor in her hands as she outlined Jada's systematic seduction, her family's betrayal, and the pregnancy that had sealed her exile from the only life she had ever known. De-Young listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation about his son's character and choices. When she finished speaking, his silence stretched long enough for her to wonder if learning about her connection to his family would change everything between them. Finally, he spoke with quiet fury that suggested he was restraining himself from expressing opinions that would be unfit for polite company. He told her that he was ashamed of his son's behavior, disgusted by the casual cruelty and cowardice that Minj had displayed in choosing convenience over loyalty. The woman standing beside him possessed more integrity in her smallest gesture than his son had demonstrated in months of calculated deception. His defense of her worth against his own flesh and blood felt like vindication for every moment of self-doubt she had experienced since learning about Jada's pregnancy. Here was someone with the power to choose sides, and he was choosing her over family loyalty and social convenience. When he asked if she wanted to leave, if the evening had been ruined by unwelcome reminders of people who had forfeited their right to affect her happiness, his concern was entirely focused on her comfort rather than his own social obligations. The offer represented more than simple courtesy. It was acknowledgement that her feelings mattered more to him than maintaining appearances or avoiding awkward conversations. She looked back toward the ballroom where her designs had created magic for hundreds of donors committed to healing children's suffering, where her work had proven its worth among people who understood excellence. Leaving would mean allowing Jada and Minj to steal this triumph, just as they had stolen everything else that had mattered to her. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and told him she preferred to stay, to enjoy the success they had created together and refused to be diminished by people whose opinions had lost all relevance to her life. His smile and response carried pride and admiration that made her feel invincible rather than vulnerable. They returned to the gala together with renewed purpose, his hand at her back providing strength, while her determination to claim her achievements grew stronger than any lingering pain from past betrayals. The evening belonged to them and their shared vision, not to people who had chosen manipulation over authenticity. The photographs appeared everywhere within hours of the gala's conclusion, splashed across society pages and social media feeds with speculation that made Mira's stomach clench with dread. Images of her beside De Jong at Seoul's most exclusive charitable event, his hand possessively at her back, while she smiled with confidence that belonged to someone who clearly fit among the city's elite. The captions ranged from curious to scandalous, identifying De Jong as one of Seoul's most powerful and mysterious businessmen while questioning the identity of his striking companion. Some articles mentioned her role as the event's designer, but most focused on the obvious intimacy between them and what it might mean for his business empire and social standing. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, messages and calls from numbers she recognized with growing anxiety. Her parents, her extended family, former friends who had sided with Jada during the breakup, but now wanted information about her sudden elevation to Seoul's inner circles. She ignored them all while getting dressed for what she knew would be the most difficult conversation of her life. The family meeting had been demanded through increasingly urgent text messages, her mother's words growing more desperate and angry with each unanswered notification. The family home felt smaller than she remembered, cramped with judgment and disappointment that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her parents sat on the couch like tribunal members preparing to deliver a verdict, while Jada occupied the armchair that had always been reserved for honored guests or special occasions. Jada looked pale and exhausted, her pregnancy glow replaced by dark circles and obvious stress that made her condition appear more burden than blessing. She held her phone displaying the society page photos, her expression mixing fury with something that might have been envy for Mira's transformation from discarded sister into someone worth photographing beside powerful men. Her father spoke first, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when delivering ultimatums that expected immediate compliance. He informed her that the family was mortified by the publicity, humiliated by seeing her associated with someone whose reputation carried whispers of violence and criminal connections. The photos made them look like they had raised someone willing to compromise any principle for money and social advancement. Her mother's contribution focused on Jada's delicate condition, explaining how the stress of seeing Mira's behavior splashed across newspapers had triggered complications that required bed rest and careful monitoring. The doctors had warned that emotional upheaval could threaten both mother and baby, making Mira's selfish pursuit of inappropriate relationships literally dangerous to innocent lives. The accusation hit like a physical blow, suggesting that her happiness could cost an unborn child's life through some twisted logic that made her responsible for consequences of choices that had nothing to do with her actions. Jada's health problems became weapons designed to guilt her into submission while positioning her sister as victim rather than manipulator who had created this entire situation. When her father demanded that she end all contact with De Jong immediately, his tone carried threats that went beyond disappointment or social embarrassment. He explained that they couldn't afford to be associated with criminal elements, that their reputation in the community depended on maintaining distance from people whose business interests existed in gray areas that law-abiding families should avoid. The hypocrisy was stunning in its completeness. These were the same people who had celebrated Minj's ambitions and connections, who had encouraged Jada's pursuit of someone whose family obviously operated in spheres where moral compromises were routine business practices. But when Mira found value and respect in similar circles, suddenly those connections became shameful and dangerous. Jada's voice was weak but determined as she explained how betrayed she felt seeing Mira with Minj's father, how the situation made her relationship with her boyfriend impossibly complicated. She needed family support during this vulnerable time, not sister who seemed determined to destroy any chance of peaceful coexistence with the man she loved and whose child she carried. The manipulation was masterful, positioning Jada as someone whose happiness and health depended entirely on Mira's willingness to sacrifice her own newfound joy for family harmony. Every word was calculated to maximize guilt while minimizing acknowledgement of how the current situation had originated from Jada's own calculated betrayal months earlier. When Minj arrived unexpectedly, his presence adding another layer of tension to an already volatile confrontation, his explanation about pressure from his father revealed cracks in the perfect relationship that Jada had worked so hard to create. He spoke about business considerations and family image, about how his father's growing interest in Mira was creating complications that affected their entire organization's stability and reputation. His admission that De Jong had expressed disappointment in his son's character choices sent shockwaves through the room, suggesting that even Minj's own father found his behavior toward Mira questionable. The Golden Couple's foundation was proving less stable than anyone had assumed, built on compromises and pressures that threatened to collapse under scrutiny from someone with actual authority and moral standards. The family meeting was reaching fever pitch when the doorbell chimed with authority that somehow conveyed importance even through simple sound. Her father moved toward the entrance with obvious irritation at the interruption, his voice carrying across the house as he spoke to whoever had arrived with increasing deference that suggested recognition of someone whose presence demanded respect regardless of convenience. De Jong entered the living room with the measured grace that she had come to associate with barely controlled power, his expensive suit and confident bearing immediately transforming the shabby space into something that seemed unworthy of his attention. His security detail remained outside, but their presence was implied in the careful way he positioned himself near the entrance and assessed the room's occupants with professional thoroughness. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he took in the scene before him. The family tribunal arranged against Mira, while she sat isolated and obviously under attack from people who should have been protecting her interests. His expression remained neutral, but she could see anger building in the tension around his eyes and the careful control he was exercising over his response to witnessing her humiliation. Her father attempted to take charge of the conversation with bluster about protecting his daughter from unsuitable influences, explaining that they were concerned about her association with someone whose reputation carried implications that could damage her future prospects. The words sounded hollow even to their speaker when delivered to someone whose presence commanded respect through simple force of personality. De Jong's response was quiet and controlled, but his words carried weight that made everyone in the room understand they were being evaluated by someone accustomed to making decisions with life-changing consequences. He explained that he had come to understand the family dynamics that had shaped Mira's character, and he was impressed by her strength in rising above treatment that would have broken someone with less integrity and determination. When Jada attempted to explain her delicate condition and the stress that Mira's choices were causing, De Jong's attention turned toward her with the clinical assessment of someone who recognized manipulation regardless of how it was packaged. His observation that stress seemed more likely to result from maintaining lies than from confronting truth carried implications that made Jada shrink back into her chair with obvious discomfort. His offer to cover any medical expenses related to Jada's pregnancy was delivered with courtesy that carried undertones of dismissal, making it clear that he understood exactly what kind of people he was dealing with and what motivations drove their concerns about his relationship with Mira. The financial gesture removed their ability to claim hardship, while simultaneously demonstrating that their objections had nothing to do with protecting anyone's well-being. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of disappointment he felt in his son's choices and character, his quiet devastation at realizing the kind of family that had raised someone to abandon loyalty and integrity for convenience and social positioning. His words to Minj carried weight of judgment that suggested their relationship had been fundamentally damaged by revelations about how he had treated someone who deserved protection rather than betrayal. When he asked to speak with Mira privately, the request was delivered with authority that made it clear he was not seeking permission from people whose opinions had ceased to matter in any meaningful way. They moved toward the small garden behind the house, away from ears that would twist every word into ammunition for future arguments and manipulation attempts. Under the fading afternoon light, surrounded by neglected plants that reflected the family's inability to nurture anything requiring consistent care and attention, he told her that she deserved people who would cherish her worth rather than constantly seeking ways to diminish it for their own convenience. Her talents and character should be celebrated rather than treated as threats to other people's insecure relationships and fragile egos. His voice carried conviction that left no doubt about his sincerity as he explained that family should be a source of strength and support rather than constant criticism and emotional manipulation. The people inside that house had forfeited their right to influence her decisions when they chose cruelty over compassion and self-interest over her well-being. Standing there in the garden where she had played as a child, surrounded by memories of always being second choice and never quite enough, Mira realized that she was being offered something she had never experienced before. Unconditional acceptance from someone powerful enough to protect what he valued, respect for her abilities from someone whose opinion carried weight that could change her entire future. The decision crystallized with startling clarity as she looked back toward the house, where her family waited for her to choose obligation over happiness, duty over dignity. They had made their choice months ago when they celebrated Jada's betrayal and treated Mira's pain as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of what they considered more advantageous relationships. When she told him that she was ready to build something new with someone who valued her completely rather than conditionally, his smile carried relief and satisfaction that suggested he had been hoping for exactly that answer. They walked back toward the house together, her hand in his providing strength for the conversation that would sever ties that should have been sources of love but had become chains designed to keep her diminished and controllable. The family's reaction to her announcement was predictably dramatic. Threats of disownment mixed with accusations of selfishness and ingratitude that revealed the depth of their inability to accept responsibility for driving away someone who could have been their greatest source of pride. But their words no longer carried power to wound someone who had finally found protection from people who understood her worth and were willing to defend it against anyone who sought to diminish it. The call came at 3 a.m, jolting Mira from sleep into Yang's penthouse, where she had been staying since choosing him over her family's ultimatums. His voice was calm but alert as he answered, the kind of controlled response that suggested he was accustomed to crisis management at any hour. Jada was in the hospital with pregnancy complications, her condition serious enough that the medical team was requesting family presence for what they delicately termed potential difficult decisions. The irony was devastating in its completeness. The same family who had disowned Mira for choosing happiness over their approval now needed her presence during their golden child's moment of genuine crisis. De Jong dressed with efficient grace while explaining that they would respond regardless of how poorly her family had behaved, because emergencies revealed character in ways that social situations never could. How someone treated people during crisis moments mattered more than how they performed during comfortable times, and he wanted to ensure that Mira's conscience remained clear regardless of other people's choices. The drive to Seoul National University Hospital passed in tense silence, city lights blurring past windows, while Mira processed the strange reversal of circumstances that found her rushing toward people who had recently declared her dead to them. De Jong's presence beside her provided stability that allowed her to focus on what truly mattered rather than getting lost in the emotional complexity of family relationships that had become toxic beyond repair. The emergency department was controlled chaos, medical professionals moving with purposeful urgency, while families huddled in waiting areas trying to process information that would reshape their understanding of what they had assumed was predictable and secure. Her parents looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by fear and the realization that their careful manipulation of family dynamics meant nothing when confronted with genuine medical emergency. Minj appeared overwhelmed in ways that revealed his fundamental inadequacy for handling crisis situations that required actual strength rather than social positioning and political maneuvering. His expensive suit looked ridiculous in the hospital environment, his perfectly styled appearance seeming shallow and inappropriate when his girlfriend was fighting for her life and that of their unborn child. The medical team's explanation was sobering in its technical precision. Jada was experiencing severe preeclampsia that threatened both her life and the baby's survival, requiring immediate delivery despite the pregnancy being weeks from full term. The procedures carried significant risks, and family needed to understand that outcomes were uncertain regardless of the medical team's expertise and the hospital's excellent reputation. What became clear within the first hour was that Minj possessed no capacity for the kind of partnership that medical emergencies demanded. He paced the waiting room, making phone calls about rescheduling business meetings and managing public relations implications, treating his girlfriend's crisis as an inconvenience to be handled through proper spin control rather than a life-threatening situation requiring his complete attention and support. De Jong observed Minj's behavior with increasing disappointment, recognizing that his son's response to genuine crisis revealed character flaws that went beyond simple immaturity or social awkwardness. This was someone fundamentally incapable of putting another person's needs before his own comfort and convenience, even when that person was carrying his child and fighting for survival. When the medical team requested specific family medical history that only Jada could provide, Minj proved unable to answer even basic questions about her health background, medications she was taking, or previous medical concerns. His ignorance about someone he claimed to love enough to start a family with revealed the shallow foundation of their entire relationship. Mira found herself providing more useful information to the medical team than the baby's actual father, drawing on observations from years of living with someone whose health had always been treated as a family concern rather than individual responsibility. Her calm responses and detailed knowledge stood in stark contrast to Minj's obvious panic and uselessness during the emergency. As hours passed in the surgical waiting area, the family dynamics that had seemed so solid began collapsing under pressure that exposed their artificial nature. Her parents whispered anxiously about what would happen if Jada didn't survive, how they would manage raising a premature infant while dealing with grief and Minj's obvious inability to handle parental responsibilities. The conversation revealed truths that had been carefully hidden behind social conventions and family loyalty performances. They admitted that Minj had never seemed genuinely invested in Jada as a person, that his attention had always focused more on family connections and business advantages than emotional connection or partnership building. Her mother's tearful confession that they had encouraged Jada's pursuit of Minj because they thought his family's wealth and influence would provide security revealed the calculated nature of what they had presented as romantic love. Their golden child's relationship had been a business transaction dressed up as fairy tale romance, with Jada's pregnancy serving as insurance policy rather than joyful family planning. When Minj broke down completely during the longest part of the surgical wait, his admission that he had never actually loved Jada shocked no one who had been paying attention to his behavior patterns. He explained through tears that his father's expectations and family pressure had pushed him toward relationships that looked appropriate rather than ones that felt genuine, and he had trapped himself in a situation where he was playing a role rather than living authentically. The revelation destroyed any remaining illusion about the perfect couple that her family had celebrated while sacrificing Mira's happiness on the altar of their social ambitions. Everything they had gained by choosing Jada over their other daughter was revealed as hollow performance, masking fundamental incompatibility and mutual deception. De Jong's response to his son's breakdown was measured disappointment rather than surprise, suggesting he had recognized Min's character limitations long before the current crisis forced them into open display. His quiet observation that integrity couldn't be taught to someone who had reached adulthood without developing authentic values carried weight of final judgment on their relationship. The successful delivery of Jada's daughter brought relief, mixed with new complications that would reshape family dynamics permanently. The premature infant required intensive care that would demand months of careful attention and significant financial resources, challenges that Min was obviously unprepared to handle either emotionally or practically. Her parents' attempt to reconcile with Mira during the post-surgery relief period was rejected with quiet firmness that left no room for misunderstanding about where they stood. She explained that emergency situations didn't erase months of deliberate cruelty and manipulation, that showing up during crisis didn't compensate for choosing convenience over character when decisions actually mattered. The trust had been broken in ways that couldn't be repaired through tearful apologies or promises to do better in future situations. They had revealed their true values when they thought the cost of honesty would be minimal, and those revelations couldn't be unseen or forgotten simply because circumstances had changed. De Jong's formal proposal came not in the hospital waiting room, but later that week in his private garden, surrounded by carefully tended beauty that represented his commitment to nurturing things that brought joy rather than simply managing things that brought profit. His words carried weight of someone who understood that building something meaningful required patience, dedication, and genuine respect for what was being created. He spoke about partnership that would honor both their strengths while supporting each other through whatever challenges their different backgrounds might create. His world carried dangers and moral complexities that she would need to understand and accept, but it also offered protection and resources that could allow her talents to flourish without the limitations that economic insecurity created. The choice he offered was genuine rather than manipulative, complete information about what their life together would require alongside absolute freedom to choose differently if her heart led her elsewhere. His honesty about the criminal elements of his business empire was balanced by evidence of the legitimate philanthropy and community building that occupied most of his time and energy. Media attention around their relationship had shifted from speculation to acceptance as Seoul's social circles recognized that De Jong's choice of partner carried weight that transcended gossip and entertainment. Business associates and charitable organizations began treating Mira with the respect accorded to someone whose opinions influenced decisions that mattered in their community. Her design career flourished under the protection of his reputation and connections, clients competing for her attention rather than questioning her qualifications or demanding justification for her creative choices. The professional respect she had always craved became natural consequence of association with someone who valued excellence and refused to accept mediocrity. The new family they created together was built on choice rather than blood, mutual respect rather than obligation, genuine care rather than social convention. De Jong's security detail became protective older brothers who treated her safety as sacred responsibility, while his business associates included her in conversations that acknowledged her intelligence and respected her perspectives. Standing in the same garden where he had proposed, watching him play with neighborhood children who had no idea their benefactor controlled an empire that could reshape their futures with single phone calls, Mira understood that she had found something rarer than romantic love. She had discovered partnership that honored her completely while challenging her to become more than she had ever imagined possible. The explosion that destroyed her original family's artificial harmony had cleared space for something authentic to grow in its place. Love that was chosen rather than assigned, respect that was earned rather than demanded, loyalty that flowed both directions rather than serving as weapon to maintain control over people who deserved better treatment. Jada's daughter would grow up in a world where her uncle's girlfriend was someone who had chosen integrity over convenience, strength over comfort, authentic connection over safe mediocrity. The example might matter someday when she faced her own choices between what felt easy and what felt true. Sometimes the people we're born to aren't the people who truly see us for who we are. Sometimes finding our real family means having the courage to walk away from the people who should have cherished us but chose to diminish us instead. Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and protecting your own happiness? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how you've navigated those impossible choices between loyalty and self-respect, because your experiences might help someone else who's facing that same difficult decision.